Dr. Fida Adely. Dr. Adely is an associate professor at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, where she also holds the Clovis and Hala, Salaam, Maksoud Chair in Arab Studies. As an anthropologist, her research spans education, labor, development, and gender in the Arab world, with a particular focus on Jordan. I've had the privilege of knowing Dr. Adely for over 2 decades. Our paths first crossed when we were both doctoral students at Teachers College, Colombia University. I was starting out, she was finishing up. And at the time, I was a new editor for the Comparative and International Education Journal, known as SICE. And I still remember a 2004 article that she had written for the first issue that I was a part of, which focused on participation in development work. This piece left a lasting impression on me, not just in terms of the specific topic of development work more broadly, but also in how it made me think about the practice of teaching itself. Even then, it was clear that she was an incredible and thoughtful and engaged researcher and educator. And while Dr. Adely might not know it, that article and her scholarship since has deeply influenced my own thinking and teaching. Her scholarship is both expansive and incisive. She's author of Gendered Paradoxes, Educating Jordanian Women in Nation, Faith, and Progress, and more recently, or the book she'll be presenting on today, Working Women in Jordan, Education, Migration, and Aspiration. Beyond these books, her extensive and nuanced body of work critically examines education, labor, and the structural forces that shape people's lives in the region, particularly with a focus on women and girls. Not only is Dr. Adely an exceptional scholar, but also a tireless advocate for social justice. She is a powerful voice in public and academic conversations about justice, equity, and human dignity. She is unafraid to ask difficult questions and to challenge dominant narratives, especially when they obscure the lived realities of those most affected by displacement, occupation, and structural violence. Her work is a reminder to us that scholarship is never neutral, and that intellectual inquiry is deeply tied to ethical responsibility. We're very grateful that she made it here today despite the weather and the delays, and thank you all for being so patient. I know we're in for a treat, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Fida Adely.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Amina. And I was remembering that the last time I was here is when you invited me to come speak, maybe 10 years ago, I don't know. But thank you so much. You know, I benefited and continue to benefit so much from the peers that I met in graduate school, Amina being amongst them. We have a WhatsApp group that was recently added to, and it continues to give us nourishment to be able to connect with each other and commiserate with each other. So I want to thank Amina for inviting me, Lauren for organizing my trip, Joy and Sarah for picking me up at the train station. It takes a village to make these things happen, so I appreciate you all. I appreciate you all being here on a snowy afternoon. I must start by saying that, you know, this book came out in May 2024, and the release of a book is often a joyous occasion. But of course, the release of this book was tempered for me by the terrible violence that I was watching unfold in Gaza. And as an education scholar in particular, by watching, mourning, documenting scholasticide, the destruction of educational institutions, the systematic destruction of educational institutions in Gaza. And this is something I have to, even though this, and what's interesting, as we'll find out, is this book, which is not about Gaza, which is about Jordan, is very connected to some of the things that are happening today in the news. The King of Jordan was in DC, he may still be in DC yesterday. And as I talk about kind of the making of this state and the ways in which migration, displacement, and education have been central to the making of that state, we will see quite clearly how connected that is to the present. So, what is my book about? Working Women in Jordan. So, this book is about women who migrate from the provinces in Jordan to the capital city of Amman to work. I'll tell you a little bit more about who they are. But I started meeting and hearing about women in my own family, and I should say my family immigrated to the US from Jordan. So I started hearing stories of folks, of young women living on their own in Amman, and I was a little surprised by this, because for the most part, both adult men and women live with their families until they marry, unless they migrate. But migration for women was not unheard of historically, but was not this particular pattern of migration from provinces to Amman was relatively new. So what brought me to the topic, in addition to having met these women, is, my first book was called Gendered Paradoxes, and one of the questions I really took up there, but let me start by saying, what is the paradox, right? So Jordan is a country that is rarely framed as a development paradox. And the crux of that paradox is women are educated, they're relatively well educated, often more than their male peers, but they don't enter the labor force participation at the same rate as their male peers, and they have one of the lowest, actually, formal labor force participation rates in the world. And gendered paradoxes used to talk about the region more broadly. And I would say even today, there's even a new iteration of gendered paradox. There's something called the gender equality paradox. And the new paradox is, wow, these Arab women, they also tend to go into STEM fields at a much higher rate than American women do. And this must be paradoxical, right? Because these are societies that are not gender equal. And so this framework of paradox is troubling to me. It's troubling to me today. And I'm actually doing this project on Arab women in computing that contests the assumptions embedded in framing women's choices to go into STEM and computing fields as paradoxical. But what's interesting for this current book project that I'm going to talk about today is, in the first project, I really tried to emphasize decentering kind of the economic goals of education, and really tried to ask, well, what are the other kind of goals of education? And I spent a year doing an ethnography in a girls' high school to understand even the day-to-day, what is the significance of young women being in a secondary school in Jordan in this day and age, but also what do these women and their families kind of assume, or what kind of value did they attribute to education. So I really wanted to kind of move away from the labor force discussion. But in this book, I focus on a group of women who migrate, they're university educated, and they migrate because they're educated, and they emphasize that. They emphasize that their migration is driven by aspirations tied to their educational attainment, and I'll say more about that in a sec. The other thing is that these women don't fit, so there's a kind of like a real industry of producing reports about why women don't work in Jordan. What's interesting is a few years ago, the World Bank did a kind of behavioral study of Jordan, trying to kind of tease this out, what cultural values might be explaining women's lack of labor force participation. And one of the really interesting things about that study is when they asked Jordanians what percentage of women they thought worked, the number was really high. It was like 60 or 70%. They thought 60 to 70% of women were in the labor force. The numbers are more like 15%. So that is an interesting point to think about, and I'll come back to it. But so the women I was talking to were mobile, right? They're leaving home, coming to the capital. And so they didn't fit into this framework that usually kind of focused on cultural barriers and the lack of mobility of women as the primary obstacle. So here were these women who were very mobile. Why was this the case? This is what I was trying to find out. How did it come to be that women who came from communities that were considered relatively conservative, within Jordan, were considered even more conservative, how were they more mobile? Why? And how did it come to be that they were able to make this move? So this project was very much a team effort. I worked very closely with a young woman who herself had made this migration from the provinces to the capital. I had known her years before that and was surprised to find out that she was living in Amman when I connected with her in Amman. We worked very closely. She did many of the initial interviews for me, and And then I did follow-up interviews, but this project wouldn't have happened without her. I also, working with another research assistant, decided to talk to women who had migrated in the past. The migration of the past was a very different one. It was women from urban areas or educated women going to rural areas as school teachers. There were other kinds of migration, but other kinds of migration that was not internal. But the only other kind of internal migration I'd heard about was overwhelmingly in this sector of education, and it was a temporary migration to rural areas to staff new schools. We also interviewed dormitory staff because most of these women are living in student dormitories in the capital. And I would say that media analysis, so to what degree is the media actually talking about these women? Oftentimes I found that the only way they're coming up, there's lots of media coverage of two issues that are related to the book. One is dormitories and the kind of concerns people have about dormitories. And the other is women who work, whose families, who don't have control over their salaries. And that was an assumption when I talked to people in Jordan about my project. The assumption was that these women could only be doing this because their families were exploiting them. And this is an internal kind of othering, right? So the assumption is these communities are very conservative, and the only way their parents would have let them come to the capital was because they were exploiting them. So the women ranged in age from 24 to 45. So some had just come to Amman when we talked to them, some had been there for 10 years. The majority were in their late 20s, but I went back and forth and met with a group of women over a span of, almost, I'd say about 8 years. And so they may have been in their late 20s when I met them, and their mid-30s by the time, around the time we last met. And I tried to map the the major cities are there, and the major towns, but I added all the villages or towns that these women came from, and they came from all over the country. Now, Jordan is geographically a pretty small place. I think it's smaller than Delaware, or about the size of Delaware. And is very capital-centric. All of the women were university educated, more than half were in some kind of STEM field. And beyond that, there was very little that united them, or that was similar. I collected basic socioeconomic information, and there was no discernible pattern in that respect. Now, it wasn't a statistical study. We tried to get regional diversity. But it was really interesting to see that some of the women had parents with no formal education, and some had parents with university education. Most were somewhere in between there. So quite a range of kind of family background, employment status of family. So one thing I want to just say about the book, I don't know how many have actually seen the book, but one thing I did in the book a little bit different, which is a style that others have used in different ways, is I wrote these short interludes between the chapters, because I really want to capture the whole story of some women, otherwise it felt too fragmented throughout. So between each chapter, you'll get a story of one or two people. Most of the times it's the women who have migrated. I have two stories of folks who were born in the 30s to talk about education and migration in a much earlier era, an era in which the state was really just beginning to build its educational system. And then there's one parent story of one parent kind of reflecting on their daughter leaving home. So I sort of alluded to this. Excuse me one second. I need to get a tissue out of my pocket. I have one. Yes, there it is. I should try to make sure that we have time for questions, so I'm going to try to go through this more quickly. So Jordan, I alluded to the relevance for what's happening right now in Washington, D.C. So Jordan is a country that was, created by the British. So there have always been people living in Jordan for centuries and centuries. But those who lived in Jordan had different centers that they associated with. So the north was more towards Damascus, Salt was Nablus, there were, Karak was connected to Hebron, Ma'an was connected to Saudi Arabia, But what unified what is today Jordan is basically the British carving out the country and installing the Hashemites, right, who were from Saudi Arabia as leaders of this newly carved out emirate. It was initially called an emirate. It was under British mandate control from the start. And I would say that, and I talk about this earlier history because there was no state to really speak of before that. I mean, Jordan was under Ottoman control, but it was sort of Ottoman-light. In the late Ottoman Empire, you saw attempts by the Ottomans to kind of like expand their bureaucracy more throughout the empire. But as a result, there was very little formal education, and the degree to which there was formal education around the turn of the 20th century, it was community-based religious education, both Muslim and Christian. What you saw with the creation of the state was a pretty rapid attempt to expand it, rapid efforts to expand education, and a great deal of success at that. Like if you just think about terms of access to education, rural-urban differences, very quickly the country was able, or the state was able to expand an educational system and reach pretty high rates of even secondary enrollment. So today Jordan has like 90% secondary enrollment, something around 40% post-secondary enrollment, which both statistics are higher than many parts of the US. They've also expanded higher education to rural areas. So there are a lot of issues, and I'll talk about those issues, but in a very kind of short period of time, they were able to rapidly expand education. Now this is pretty remarkable given the ways in which the country has been shaped by forced displacement and migration, right? Because Jordan was a country with a population of about 400,000 in 1948, when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced from their homes, 70,000 of whom ended up in Jordan, and then Jordan annexed the West Bank, and so suddenly it incorporated this whole other territory and this whole other Palestinian population. There were some good things that came out of that in terms of educational expansion. Part of the reason why Jordan was able to expand education so quickly was a reliance on Palestinian teachers. And the Palestinian cities had a much longer history of providing formal education, so those teachers then became a cadre of teachers that could help in the expansion of education. 1950, UNRWA gets established in Jordan to provide education for Palestinian refugees. UNRWA schools for a very long time were considered also of better quality for a number of different reasons. And today, UNRWA still educates 120,000 children in Jordan each year. I guess the other part of this history that, and I should say, like, there have been successive waves of new populations, right? So in 1967, almost 400,000 Palestinians are expelled from their homeland and end up in Jordan. With those successive wars in Iraq, Jordan also becomes a home for many Iraqis, almost 1 million Syrians, Sudanese, Yemenis. So the country really is shaped by forced migration and war in pretty significant ways. The other thing about migration, I should say, is there's also economic migration that's been part of this history. Jordan has long been an exporter of labor and an importer of low-wage labor in particular sectors. And this is important for thinking about this so-called paradox of why women don't go into the workforce. There's really high educated unemployment in Jordan, but part of that is because of the kinds of jobs that are being created and how Jordan's economy fits into a global economy. And I can answer questions about that. I should probably get to the gist of this. So, neoliberal economic policies and imaginaries. So one of the things I wanted to really do is center the narratives of these women, but think about them in the context of the structures that they were grappling with, right? So neoliberal policies have been a key part of, have been key to kind of establishing the context in which these women come of age, get educated, and think about the use of their education. One thing about neoliberal policies is you've seen a real deterioration in the quality of education and significant inequalities. Today in Amman, over 30% of children are in private schools. This is a really new phenomenon, just the last couple of decades. And in part, it's because no one who is middle class now thinks the degree to which there even is a middle class But no one sees the public schools as an option anymore. It's an option of those who have no other options. And that was not the case in the 90s. In the 90s, the overwhelming majority of professionals sent their children to public schools. It's deteriorated significantly, rapidly, and there have been other forms of privatization, which I'm sure you're familiar with and I can talk about. But what was it? And this is very geographic too, because there's been an intensified, to the degree to which there's development, it's happening in the capital. And almost 2/3 of the population now lives in and around the capital. And so there's been a real kind of neglect of provincial areas. And the other thing is provincial areas have been more reliant on public sector labor because of the ways in which those areas were developed. And there's been a shrinking of public sector opportunities. It's not all of them. The security and intelligence has grown consistently. And then there's just what I've referred to already, the disparity is also discursive, right? The provinces have become this internal other. One last thing I'll say, gendered educational patterns. For at least 2 to 3 decades, young women have outnumbered and outperformed their male peers in education. And this is a broader pattern in the region, but it's quite pronounced in Jordan. So you'll see girls again leave boys behind. This is another article in Tojihi, which is a secondary completion exam that everybody has to take to go to college. This one says, let's get the pulse of the street. Girls outperforming boys on Tojihi. And this is very much part of I'm going to switch now to thinking about these young women. They really saw themselves as educational, as educational successes, right? They talked about why they migrated very much in terms of how well they did in school and how successful they were, and this kind of future that they imagined they should have. I mean, this is not so out of the ordinary, right? We have lots of literature on education and aspiration and the ways in which education creates particular kinds of aspiration. But the structures I was just talking about really do color some of the ways in which they think about this, right? So they see private sector opportunities as more desirable, more worthy of them, and they assume they'll be able to find those opportunities in the capital. They do a kind of internal othering of themselves, right? And they assume that any job that they can, if they can even find a job in the province, because most of them can't, but if they can, that it will be of lesser quality, that they will have fewer opportunities to develop. And so they see going to the capital essential to kind of becoming who they ought to be. And they frame it in those terms, not wasting my education. Now thinking about, I write about this in the book a lot, I talk a lot about people wasting their education, and there's a very kind of like gendered way in which they're thinking about labor and work. Because they'll say things like, oh, women who just sit at home and waste their education. So they're not thinking about the other kinds of labor women might be engaged in. They are very much kind of bought into the idea of like, what is valuable labor? But at the same time, they're not saying my mother wasted her time or my grandma, they're talking about their peers, right? So that their peers went to university with them. What are they doing sitting at home? I fought to leave. I didn't want to waste my education. I cried for a year until my parents were convinced. So some of them really had these drawn out battles with their families, and others, it was not the case. And I'll say more about the role of the family. So some of the key themes in the book are, as I said, not wasting my education, education in the future, and the ways in which they saw themselves. And these are really remarkable women. I mean, I struggled with this because I am a person who pays a lot more attention to structures. But I struggled with how to talk about it because in some cases, I mean, their own individual agency is really so central to their stories, which of course I know, but there's a way in which their personality, right, even within their own families, they decide, oh, I'm not doing what my sister did. I'm going out and doing this. So they are exceptional in some ways, but they are shaped by these larger structures, right? And so they're not completely free, of course, but they're kind of determined in ways that really comes through in their narratives. This is a picture of one of the neighborhoods that has a lot of the dormitories. It's near the university. So city limit. So I want to just say that, I talked to them a lot about once they moved to the city, did it meet their expectations professionally, socially, otherwise? And, most of them kind of came down on the side of, I'm glad I did this, even if it was hard. And it was very hard for many of them. Amman is a very expensive city, very, very expensive. Even as an engineer, a young woman might be making $400 a month as a starting engineer, and her dormitory room might cost $150 a month or $200 a month. So many of them were not making ends meet at the beginning. But they all sort of talked about, even though, and many of them felt very socially isolated, living in dormitories, not having family in a very family-oriented society, but they felt very conflicted. They talk about missing their family, especially those who had spent time in Amman for a while. But then they'd say, but when I go home, I miss what I have in Amman. And they would talk about things like leisure, the anonymity of the city, kind of just being able to move about, and then a little bit autonomy, although, autonomy in the sense of, it was very mundane kinds of things, like everyday things, like I could just go out and go to a cafe. And these kinds of spaces might not even be available depending on where they're from in the provinces, right? So it's about the kind of spaces available and the kinds of mobility that are opened up by being in what is increasingly like a big city and a relatively cosmopolitan city, parts of it. Having said that, there are real limits to their ability to enjoy that. So the financial ones are the most significant, and they really face a lot of bias, particularly if they end up working in international NGOs or international corporations where they are kind of visibly marked as more conservative because of how they dress. They don't know, their English skills may not be up to par. And even things like, my team goes out to lunch at my job, and they have no problem spending $35 on lunch, right? And so the class kind of dimensions, the class mobility there are many more barriers to the kinds of shifts that they aspire to that are class-based because of these biases and because of the material kind of limits. These are some of the dormitories, just to give you a sense. These are advertisements for dormitories, so they could be pretty basic. There was a range of them, but most of them were, not much privacy, pretty small rooms, and for some of these women who had been living in Amman for 10 years, it was challenging, right, to be a woman in her mid-30s living in a dormitory. Some women went out and moved into their own apartments, and I can talk about why and how. This is just more scenes from Amman. So I want to just say something about family, and how am I doing on time? I want to make sure we have a question. Should I wrap?
Do you think 10 more minutes is good?
Oh yeah, I could do that in 10 minutes, okay. So, family. So, in the context of Jordan, no woman would be moving to the capital without the consent of her family, right? This isn't just like somebody wakes up one day and says, I'm leaving, I don't care what you think, right? Just doesn't happen. It's not just, and this is true for men and women, more for women in some instances, but these kinds of life decisions are family decisions. Young adults consult their family. They often defer to their family. They see, there's not necessarily like conflict. They see their parents as people who have their best interests in mind. Sometimes there's conflict, right? Sometimes older brothers are like, I don't really want you to do this, and there's like internal family struggle. But these are family projects. And so women had to negotiate this. And some didn't need to do very much negotiating, but some really had to do significant negotiating to convince their families that this was in their best interest, going to Amman. And I would say for the majority, there was, a few months of kind of just going back and forth. Sometimes the parents' objections were, well, you're barely gonna make enough to cover your expenses, why would you wanna do that? Sometimes parents were just worried, do you really wanna live by yourself in a dormitory? Who's gonna take care of you? Who's going to? Others were worried about things like, reputation, my daughter living on her own, it goes against the norm. Again, it's also not the norm for men to live independently if their families are in the same city. Men don't move out and get their own apartment. The norm is to continue living with your family until you marry, unless you move somewhere else and your family's not there. So some women I told the story of the woman who said, I stayed home and cried for a year, and then they said, just go. But she was depressed because she didn't have a job and was not happy with the situation, and finally they kind of, maybe she exaggerated a little, maybe she didn't cry for a year, but she kind of And I would say of all the women we talked to, there are only a couple that really had maybe ongoing kind of tension with their family about this decision to go to Amman. And I can talk about what the nature of that tension was. And there was only one woman whose family said, come home, and she didn't go home. And there was like, they didn't talk to each other for a while, they eventually resolved, but for the everyone else, there was no like, no dispute about whether they should stay there or not. And so I can talk, and with the other woman, the tension was around money, because in that case, the way her family was actually quite poor, and she had become quite successful. And so part of how she convinced her family was supporting some of her siblings, like in different educational projects of her siblings. And so this became a source of tension between her and her family. And I'll talk about it. But this was not so the second point, did these women become breadwinners? Some did, some didn't. What was the most surprising thing to me about our research, I said how expensive it is in Amman, is how many women's parents were actually contributing to the cost of them living in Amman. And again, these are not super wealthy families, but I met a young woman who started working as an engineer for like a telecommunications company as a trainee. So they're kind of like part of the neoliberal policy thing is they now have these ways of employing students in internships, for a year or two, where they pay like $150 like a stipend, and they just keep renewing that. So like this young woman was doing that, and her salary didn't even cover the dorm. And her father was helping, because he and she had some vision that in the future things would get better. So what was really surprising to me is how many families were actually contributing to the expenses of their daughters living in Amman, especially initially. Some women didn't tell their parents that they were struggling financially and borrowed money. And then we asked, like, do you contribute to the family? And there were some women who systematically gave something to their families. There were some women who, contributed to family projects. Well, I'll pay for the private tutoring for this younger brother until he passes the TOGE. Or I'll help contribute to, restoring this home. Or I'll help hire someone to take care of my father who's getting elderly, right? And so this was something that the young women are actually quite proud of. So again, if I go back to, there was this narrative that these women were forced to do this, that they were being exploited. And there were, in a couple of instances, some tension about what the expectations were of financial contributions of these women. But for the most part, these women felt very proud that they could contribute to the household, right? They felt, and sometimes they did it in very symbolic ways, like in Jordan and probably lots of other countries. During the holidays, a man gives money to his female relatives, right? And it's like, you give money to kids, but you also give money to your female relatives, because the idea is that the female relative needs her own money to be independent of her spouse, right? So my father would do this with his sisters in the US, decades after they moved here. Every holiday he'd go and he'd give them some money and be like, this is for you. And it's almost like insurance, something that they have for themselves and they can take care of themselves. And a couple of the young women are like, I give my mother money when I go home. And no one's asking them for it, but they are so proud, because to them this is part of how they've established themselves as a person. And I bring this up because, I was reading this other book. It was about Palestinian families, and it was looking at the role of men and women in supporting their families. And the scholar kind of talked about the fact that individuals, the way she saw it is that they would defer setting up their own families, and they would kind of like deprive themselves to support their parents and their siblings. But kind of just takes starts with a basic assumption, right? That it is a norm that one should be focused on being independently autonomous, and not thinking about the ways in which, in a place like Jordan, the individual and the family are so tied up together that you wouldn't think twice about contributing to the success of your family. And I thought about this, in the US, there's this norm, which of course no one can live up to. And so what the author was saying is this is really oppressive in some ways, right? It's oppressive that young people, rather than going out and setting up their own lives, feel like they need to keep contributing to their parents' well-being. But I thought about how oppressive the expectation is here, that that young people be able to take care of themselves, be able to move out, and that if you're still living with your family, you're a failure, right? But the demographics show us that in fact, actually most young adults are living with their families, but because of our cultural norms, that's a failure, right? So it's just important, I say this to say, the family is so central, and care for the family is so central. So while these young women kind of had these neoliberal imaginaries, I want to work in the private sector, and I'm going to do this, and I'm not going to be one of these lazy people in the public sector, they were still people who were very much like, I am part of a community and a family, and caring for them is also how I define my success. And that came through quite clearly. I'm not going to say so much about this because I know I'm out of time, but I talk to young women a lot about how did they see their migration in relation to getting married, where marriage is the norm, overwhelming number of men and women get married. How did they see their migration and many of them thought they'd have more opportunities to meet compatible partners in Amman, and they complained about the fact that they didn't. And then this idea that the more they lived on their own in Amman, it was even harder to find a compatible partner because they had different expectations. And so I would say one of the biggest takeaways, particularly from the older-ish women who weren't married, was they felt like their migration had changed them so much that it became difficult to get married. And I can talk more about that. I want to end on this slide. So I use this framework of creative agency because, you have to add a theory to get a book published, right? I would have liked to just tell the stories of these women, honestly. But an agency is kind of so overwritten about in relation to Arab Muslim women because the assumption is they don't have any agency. But So when I read this interesting book by a sociologist, Lois McNay, who had kind of talked about agency as creative, and that kind of, for me, captured, there are these debates, I think, about the work of like Layla Abu-Lughod and Saba Mahmoud on agency, and I felt like creative agency was kind of this in-between. Like Saba Mahmoud says agency is not just about resisting things, and Layla Abu-Lughod says if we look at resistance, it helps us understand how power works. And I thought, what McNay is saying, and this is not, it's sort of compatible with both Mahmoud and Abu-Lughod says, is that, our agency is always contextual, that we work within particular structures, what we make with what we have. What really came through again with these women is that they were pretty powerful individuals in their own worlds, and education was a large part of that story, and the kind of aspirations and desire for mobility that education gave them. But still very much within the constructs of what they live with, right? Within this neoliberal reality after 2 to 3 decades of neoliberal economic policies, a context also of kind of, geopolitical instability, constant war, constant economic shocks, and the kind of desire for success and stability in a context in which that's very hard for most educated people, men and women, to achieve. But also their own sense, and maybe this is attributable a little bit to me, because we as researchers then ask people to reflect on these things, right? And we would talk about things like, well, why do you think you were able to do this? What has changed in Jordanian society? And what came through clearly in our conversations together is they see themselves as part of the change. Not like dramatic change. I think about this a lot as I think about, what does this kind of ethnographic, qualitative project help us to think about in terms of structural change, gender ideology. And I think the reality is the kinds of changes we see in terms of like gender roles and class, and maybe even harder in the domain of class, are always so incremental. And so we don't see them unfolding before our eyes, like in the present. And I think about these women who as part of that present, right? Part of kind of living and being in a way in which they are contributing to these incremental kind of changes in their own communities, for women, but also for men. For the men who become their partners, for their sons. And that's why I think their stories are so valuable. So I'll just end it there and see if you have any questions.
much. Does anybody have some questions? Charity has a question and Fida. Okay, so Charity can go first and then Fida.
Thank you so much for your talk. Really appreciate it. In your book, in chapter 4, there's a woman that you mentioned, her name is Hala. And she's working as a supervising engineer, and for 2 months, she is not receiving pay.
Yeah.
You also mentioned that in the previous year there was also a period of time when she didn't receive pay. I'm interested in knowing, is that common that somebody in a professional position such as hers might not receive pay? If she was a man, is it more likely that she would receive pay?
Yeah. So I've heard a few stories about this, and this is kind of the precarity of the private sector in Jordan. And it's really interesting because the women because they're this young generation who thinks, oh, the private sector is where it's at, it's where the money is, it's where the creativity is, and it's in some ways kind of internalizing that sense that the public sector is where kind of things go to die, there's no innovation there. But the reality is the private sector is not very well regulated, it's not creating jobs with stability. There was a period of time in which, like, even what do we call formal and informal? Jordan has a really high rate of informal jobs, but when we think of informal, often we think about people like selling things on the street. But some of these engineers are in informal jobs in the sense of short-term contracts, so contract labor, right? But contract labor with some precarity. So for a different project, I was actually in a focus group with a group of men and women, and one of the women brought up this problem that she had worked somewhere for 2 months and didn't get paid. And one of the men said, well, that happened to me too. The man insisted, and this is just an anecdote, because I don't have data to know how often this happens to men. The man insisted that he wouldn't put up with it. He would have left, right? And so who knows if that's true or not. I imagine that there are situations, I mean, I think about Sahar, and it's not just that she's a woman. She's also, her family's been displaced by war, right? They came as not technically refugees, what they called returnees after the first Gulf War. So all of these Palestinians and Jordanians who were kicked out of the Gulf because of the position that the Palestinian, PLO took and that Jordan took. Jordan tried to take a position of neutrality. Yasser Arafat sided with Iraq, right? So then they just wholesale kicked out people who had never lived anywhere else except Kuwait. So I think she was vulnerable in a number of ways, I guess is what I'm trying to say, right? She was more vulnerable than some of the other women, and her family was more vulnerable and much more dependent on her. So you can imagine, so I imagine that Sahar was thinking, I gotta stick this out, they're gonna come through with the money. But there's a lot of kind of like big projects that go bankrupt. There's a huge problem with debt. There's a lot of precarity in this sector, even for people with really good credentials. So I imagine gender is part of the vulnerability, but I don't think it's all of it. Because the other thing is, like, if she had connections, if she had someone to kind of back her up in Amman, she might have had somebody maybe to kind of like lobby on her behalf. So I think there are different kinds of precarity, but I don't have a good sense of it. But I do, even looking at the statistics, and I read a lot about like labor data over about 20 years, just trying to see how these women fit. And there's some work that showed the kind of increasing precarity of these private sector jobs. The other thing that I saw in that labor data was the growing significance of humanitarian and aid jobs, which, like, of course, potentially are going to all disappear. But a lot of these women go to Amman and they end up working for USAID, or they end up working for the Norwegian Refugee Council, and they're making overnight three or four times more than their fathers. Right, working as an engineer for a humanitarian organization, a foreign aid organization. So I don't know I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
I think I have a few questions, but the first one pertains to sort of your work at large as an Arab scholar studying women in the Arab world. So how do you sort of navigate the challenge of discussing issues on gender or patriarchy without sort of reinforcing Orientalist narratives or sort of fueling a lot of the narrative around those who seek to sort of weaponize these issues against their communities? And then after that, how do you sort of balance that need for honesty and critical engagement with that?
Yeah, great question. You know, it's something I've been like really struggling with my whole career. And I'll say a few things about this. One is I teach a lot of young women from the Arab world, and one of the things that they've kind of pushed back on is, why is our starting point always how the US talks about us, right? And I used to teach this women and gender class, and the first reading I would assign was Layla Abula's Do Muslim Women Need Saving? And it was all about like Barbara Bush and the US. And I remember years ago, someone saying to me, like, I don't want to keep reading that piece. Anyway, so I've shifted. I've shifted how I teach about the class. I've shifted. Now, having said that, I am sitting in the United States. Americans are often like the audience for what I write. But I try to shift a little bit away from that. I think there's also a real struggle between not feeding into kind of an imperial vision of saving women, but also not, addressing the issues that people are, that the inequalities that people are grappling with, men and women. I think for myself, I keep saying this, but I haven't done it yet. Like, I don't want to just focus on women anymore. And in this book, you'll see that even though women are the focus, I situate them in worlds that are not just women, and that's important for me. But I think part of what I learned early on is even when I wrote something that I thought was quite sensitive and nuanced, people will read into it what they want to read into it. It was actually a shock the first time I signed an article that I thought was this really nuanced treatment of women in the region. It was when I was at Teachers College, and all of my students read oppression into it. Oh, these women are so oppressed. And I was like, really? That's what you got from my article? These women are so oppressed? So it's a difficult, I think so. I try to center their stories. I try to not give romance. I try not to romanticize. Like everybody says, well, what is their migration doing for them? So I don't say, oh, they all have these wonderful, beautiful lives because they migrated. Like all of our lives, right? They're complicated, they're nuanced, and then they grow up, right? They start out at 24 saying, this is the best thing that ever happened to me, and then they're 30 and they're like, I don't know, maybe I should have never left home. I really wish I had a family now, right? And as I've gotten older, I can relate to that too. And so that's the other way, is so much of the experience of the women I interact with is not unique at all, right? There's some unique things that they're dealing with, but as university-educated women, I had my students read this last semester, and they're like, we want to talk to you about the marriage chapter, because we're all facing the same problems, So I don't know. I think it's an ongoing challenge, and we work in these institutions. I feel like I'm at the heart of the empire in DC, right? And people still say things all the time, like I went to a conference a few years ago, and they were like, oh, we really need to get those Arab women into STEM fields. And I was like, they are in STEM fields. Like 2 to 3 times more, at a rate 2 to 3 times more than they are in the US. But there's just like, these are not very educated kind of interventions, but I think there are remarkable young scholars from the region doing this work too, and really, yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I'm fascinated with the stories that you shared about the women that have migrated, and them talking about their friends that kind of stayed home as being a waste of their education. I was curious what the other side of that was. If the women that chose not to migrate, or did they also feel like they were wasting their education, or was the choice and the knowledge enough for them, or how does that play out?
Yeah. So I didn't systematically talk to women who hadn't made this choice, but I talked to a few women. So I talked to women who had been in the capital and left. I talked to sisters of some of these women. And I would say there are a number of things going on there, right? Some women, there were some jobs in the provinces. And what was interesting for some of the women I spoke to is some of them had jobs in the provinces, quit those jobs, and went to the capital, which created like a whole other layer of their parents like, seriously? You've got a good, decent, stable job in the public sector here in the provinces, and you're going to quit your job and leave? Like that created tension. Because parents saw that as like not in their interest. So I don't have like a broad kind of like broad array of of insight into that, but I will say in some cases, women are like, I don't want to do that. I want to stay here. Like, that's risky, that's hard. She's got to commute every weekend, she comes home, and she's got, like, one young woman, her sister kept trying to convince her to come to Amman and live with her, and this woman had actually gotten her own apartment, and she's like, no, I don't want to do that. I'm very comfortable where I am. And so sometimes this is where some of the women were like, seriously? But then other women, it was out of the question, right? It was out of the question from their perspective of their parents that they would live on their own. So but I would say that there are a lot of women who are educated, who are not formally employed. The highest number of women working are university educated, but there's very high unemployment rates. So unemployment as in actively seeking employment amongst university educated women. So part of the issue for women in the provinces is where they are and what kind of jobs are being created there, but that's more broadly a national problem. Having said all this, part of what I was alluding to, and I think that's what you were getting at too, right, is like, of course there's all kinds of labor that we don't see as labor that's happening in the home. And I think about some of these women who come from communities that, you know, in the 50s were still agricultural, or were still a mix of pastoral and agriculture, right? So, you know, or the woman whose parents never had any formal education. It was not too long ago when these were families were almost like at the subsistence level. Like they might have one family member were in the army, or they might have one, but these were families where the entire family was laboring. Some of these women actually even worked on farms as children. And so the idea that when they talk to me about work, that what was work fit into this category. I mean, it's not surprising given the way we talk about work now. Yeah, but I would say one other thing. Being an unemployed woman in a small town or a village that didn't necessarily have spaces for you to be in outside of the home, that constrains you that much more, right? Because if you were an unemployed, university-educated woman in Amman, for example, or maybe Idlib, there might be other things that would get you out of the home. But sometimes they literally felt like if they didn't get a job, they would be stuck at home. Because there were so few other spaces for them to be in, beyond like visiting family, just because there were no public spaces kind of available to women, and very few even available to men in a lot of these communities. Yeah.
Dina and Kylie.
Okay, thank you. I'm Dina. I'm from Jordan, from Amman actually. I've been here for a year, and it's very nostalgic to hear you talk about Amman and work. And a lot of my friends are actually women who have come from other provinces and live in Amman. I have two questions. So
Sure.
One, you talked about the role of Palestinian teachers in running the education in Amman. I wonder whether you also came across the role of Sudanese teachers, because I heard that, and I did not find enough sources to read about it, so if you have come across it, I'd love to hear more. And the other question is, can you tell us a little bit more about the social network of the lives, the social networks of these women in Amman outside of their families' lives?
Yeah. So I don't have any, the one story I know about is, so my father was a teacher in the 50s, and he was working in the Jordan Valley, and he always complained that he always said he loved the Hor, right? He loved the people, but it was too hot for him, right? Because he came from the hills. But he said that he talked about helping establish a school for girls, and that the first teacher was from Sudan there. And I remember we had this conversation because there was a woman who was elected to parliament in this area, and he was like, that's one of my girls, because of the school he established. But then he told me the story about how it was hard to get someone to staff the school, and they had a teacher from the Sudan there. Unfortunately, he passed away, and so I heard the story but never got more information. So I've heard that, and he had teachers from Damascus as well. So Fida Adely wrote a memoir. She's a Palestinian. She wrote a memoir, but her mom was from Syria, and called My Damascus. And she talks about her 3 aunts who moved to Jordan to teach. And of course, there were no borders before World War II, before 48, before the late 40s. So people moved around. I mean, my father was a teacher in the West Bank for a while too. So people moved in, yeah. So I've heard, but I imagine the Ministry of Education must have records about something like this. And teachers, in an interesting way, teachers were always much more mobile because, Palestinian teachers after 67, many of them were going to work in the Gulf, women and men. Jordanian teachers as well, because there were these kind of exchanges, because some of the Gulf states started their educational systems much later, right? Didn't even have like I think the Saudis didn't even establish like a Ministry of Education until the 70s, and so there was a lot of reliance on Palestinian teachers, Jordanian teachers to fill these roles. So their social lives, I mean, they really created communities amongst them. I mean, the ones who stayed, so the ones who were only there for a few years, it ended up being kind of temporary. I mean, they stayed in Amman. Oftentimes they married and stayed in Amman. I forgot to talk about, there was one young woman who left and she just couldn't cut it financially. She couldn't cut it financially, so she decided to commute, because in some cases, or many cases, the women were coming from communities where they could commute, but it's a very difficult commute. Not a great transportation system, not predictable. And so one young woman who was living in the capital was like, I just couldn't afford it anymore. So I left. And I heard stories about women leaving. Amongst this older, late 20s, early 30s, they do create kind of a community for themselves. They miss, but Jordan's so family-centered, right? They really miss that interaction with family. Some go home more than others. They go out, they smoke shisha, they have coffee, they have these spaces that might not be available to them otherwise. In the dormitories, I think it's a bit harder as they got older, right? Because you're much younger, like 18-year-old. These are student dormitories, like officially student dormitories. So oftentimes they felt a little bit kind of disconnected from the people they were living with. They created networks. Some of them got involved in volunteer work. They joined these like walking groups on the weekends. So especially as they got a bit more settled and a little bit more secure financially, they sought out these other kinds of spaces of socializing, and they created communities for themselves amongst other women who had come from the provinces. But they also talked about how especially the ones who came from small towns and villages, how much their view of the world expanded by coming to the capital. So for example, some women came from communities that didn't have any Palestinians, right? Because they came from a small village in the south. And so the first time they interacted with Jordanian, so the overwhelming majority of Palestinians in Jordan have Jordanian citizenship. But the overwhelming majority of Jordanians of Palestinian descent are in Amman or Zarqa and Erbil, which is another major city, right? So some women may not have interacted with Palestinians. Some were Palestinian and their families had moved to these provincial areas for work or something like that. So they did create these other relationships and communities, but I think as they got older, the older women expressed a sense of missing something, right? They wanted their own families, and they were kind of reflecting on that, prodded by me. Like, what does the future hold for me as a single woman living away from my family in the capital?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I have to kind of follow up on the economic side of the migration from the provinces to Amman. Did you see any any data or anything that you might have collected about the longevity and sustainability of their work in STEM fields, either being a single woman or a married woman, kind of their trajectory, the guarantee of it, taking that step to migrate to this big city, and putting a lot of risks in play, and then how does that work out for them in 10, 15 years? How is that guaranteed?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some women who kind of, well, I would say there are a lot of risks, right? I mean, look at just what's happening right now with the US. Jordan is a hugely aid-dependent country. A lot of the kinds of, I say this always in my development class, probably the strongest impact of aid organizations is creating jobs for professionals, for like university educated professionals, right? You create a whole kind of industry of NGOs, and Jordan has started counting this as its own sector, and the overwhelming majority are women in this sector. And that is really precarious, right? The emergency is over, or the focus has moved to a different emergency. How does that impact these humanitarian organizations? Or USAID gets disbanded. Jordan is probably per capita one of the top 5 in terms of aid. Now, a lot of that is military aid, so I don't think there's a lot of security. And then the private sector, Jordan after the 90s, signed a peace treaty with Israel, opened its borders up to all kinds of new investment, and they bet a lot on tourism. And then one thing happened, and there was no tourism for 2 years. A few years go by, and they very kind of responsibly and dutifully respond to, what these international organizations are saying to them. Oh, we need, educational systems that respond to the market. Okay, let's create all these new tourism training programs, hotel management programs, and, the second intifada starts and nobody comes to Jordan anymore. 9/11 happens, nobody comes to Jordan anymore. Right now, probably, a lot of people are not going to Jordan, even though nothing's actually happening in Jordan, but our sense of Jordan. So I think there's so much instability. There's really good labor force data, like the panel survey data. I don't know if you're familiar with the Economic Research Forum that's based in Cairo. They do a lot of kind of work analyzing that data over time. They've produced 2 volumes where they really kind of try to break this down. I think for some of these women, they're very savvy, right? They moved from different things. They figured out ways to create better jobs. Some of them have become consultants. I think this latest hit of aid is going to be hard. Now, some of them are in the public sector. So this is the interesting thing. I didn't talk about this, but a few of the women had been teachers. And they quit their jobs as teachers because they wanted something different. And that was a big point of contention with family at first. How could you quit this most secure job and a great job for when you have kids one day, you'll be able to balance family and work. But some of them, for example, I knew one woman was an engineer working in the Ministry of Health. And one of them was a teacher who became a staff member at the Ministry of Ed doing professional development. And what's interesting is given how precarious the private sector is, the public sector makes so much sense, right? But there's been this narrative that the public sector is dead end for anyone who has aspirations or anyone who wants to be someone. But the private sector is really quite precarious. A lot depends on networks. So the women, I can see them on LinkedIn, things. I just interviewed for another project, 15 men and women working in gender and development. We interviewed them last year about their experiences in that sector. I mean, these are folks who figured out how to navigate this system, but this is a pretty big hit, what's happening right now. And it remains to be seen. And Jordan is so dependent on aid that it really has very little autonomy, and now it's being asked to take it's being asked to partake in the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, to be frank. But they have, and the king kind of reflected his position in the way he performed his press conference yesterday, which is he doesn't really have very much power. It's a country created by the British that has been aid dependent from the start. It doesn't mean that people don't feel attachment to it. It doesn't mean that people don't even feel attachment to him, because people crave a stability that is not there in the region. And even if they're not thrilled about the monarchy, that has provided some stability. Not everybody feels that way, but some people do. And it's very dangerous days right now. It's very dangerous days.
I was hoping we could end on a more positive note. I think we're kind of out of time. We can't really say thank you so much. That was really